If gold truly attains the status of a fully fledged high-quality liquid asset, this will not just be a technical change in banking standards, but a fundamental shift in the entire architecture of the global financial system. At that moment, the very logic by which the world has lived for the past decades will be broken. Because for the first time since the final break with the gold standard in the early 70s, there will appear a universal collateral that is not tied to the jurisdiction of any single state, not subject to the political will of a single center of power, and not dependent on the debt sustainability of any particular economy. This is precisely the moment the world has been unconsciously waiting for all these years, gradually accumulating contradictions that could not be resolved within the framework of the dollar system. After all, the problem with the dollar lies not only in the printing press and not only in the growth of the US national debt, but in the fact that the dollar system has turned from a tool of trade into a tool of control. It has ceased to be neutral. Any asset denominated in dollars or held within the Western financial infrastructure automatically becomes political. It can be used as a lever of pressure, as a means of punishment, or as an instrument of blackmail. And this is understood not only by the geopolitical rivals of the United States, but also by its formal allies, who are increasingly asking themselves, what will happen if one day their interests diverge from those of Washington? In this situation, China is acting not emotionally or reactively, but purely pragmatically. It does not declare war on the dollar directly, does not stage loud demarches, and does not make any abrupt moves. Instead, it is building an alternative step by step, which at a certain point will simply become more convenient, more reliable, and more profitable. This is exactly how real systemic shifts always happen, not through slogans and conflicts, but through changes in economic viability. The creation of a gold corridor within the BRICS countries and friendly states is not an attempt to return to the past, as critics sometimes try to portray it, but on the contrary, an attempt to adapt the oldest universal asset to the realities of a digital and globalized world. Physical gold in vaults, when connected with modern payment systems, clearing mechanisms, and bilateral trade agreements, is transformed into something fundamentally new. It is no longer just a bar in a safe or a symbol of wealth, but an infrastructural element around which lending, trade, and investment can be built. It is important to understand that China is not acting alone. Many countries of the global south, as well as states with developed industries but limited access to cheap dollars, are closely watching this entire transformation. For them, the ability to use gold as collateral opens fundamentally new horizons. This means that to build roads, ports, power plants, logistics hubs, and industrial clusters, it will no longer be necessary to accumulate dollars or buy US government bonds. It will be enough to have access to physical gold and to a system that recognizes it as full-fledged financial security. It is here that China's true goal becomes clear. It's not so much about undermining the dollar as it is about creating a parallel channel for financing global development. A channel that does not depend on the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other institutions built under the control of Western countries. For decades, these institutions dictated terms, imposed structural reforms, and directly determined the economic policies of entire regions. China offers an alternative without political conditions, but with a strict link to real assets. In this context, gold becomes a kind of universal language of trust. Everyone understands it. It is perceived the same way in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. It does not require faith in anyone's promises and does not rely on the reputation of any particular country. Its value needs no explanation. That is precisely why China is betting on it, rather than on abstract digital constructs or complex financial derivatives. As this system develops, we will inevitably see a gradual redistribution of global capital flows. The dollar will not disappear or lose its value overnight, but its role will begin to change. It will cease to be the sole ticket to the world of global finance. This will lead to higher borrowing costs for the US, a decrease in demand for treasury bonds, and the need to reconsider the entire budget model built on the constant accumulation of debt. For investors, this process will also have far-reaching consequences. The growing role of gold as an infrastructural asset will inevitably change how it is perceived in financial markets. It will no longer be just a defensive tool for times of crisis, but will become an active element of global liquidity. This means that its price will depend less and less on short-term speculation and more on structural demand from governments and banks. Against this backdrop, it is especially interesting to observe how attitudes toward alternative assets, such as Bitcoin, are changing. As trust in fiat currencies erodes and interest in limited supply resources grows, digital assets are beginning to be seen not as the opposite of gold, but as its ideological ally. They address the same problem, but in different ways. Gold, through its physical scarcity and millennia-long history of trust, and Bitcoin, through mathematical scarcity and decentralization. However, it is gold that is now in the spotlight because it is already integrated into the existing financial system and can be adapted without completely destroying it. China understands this perfectly and uses it as a strategic advantage. It doesn't break the system, but quietly changes its key elements, adapting them to its own interests and to the interests of those countries that are willing to follow this path. When we talk about transitioning to a new system, it's important to understand that it won't look like a sudden collapse of the old world and the instant birth of a new one. It will be a long, multi-layered process in which old and new forms of money will coexist, conflict, complement each other, and gradually redistribute influence. The dollar will not disappear, but it will lose its monopoly. Gold will not become the only standard, but it will once again take a central place in the architecture of trust. Bitcoin will not replace all currencies, but it will become a benchmark for digital forms of value. The most important thing here is that for the first time in many decades, countries have a real choice. Previously, that choice was only an illusion. One could talk about sovereignty, but if you needed access to global capital, trade, and finance, you inevitably ended up in the dollar system with all its rules. Now, however, a situation is emerging where it is possible to connect to alternative circuits without completely severing ties with the existing ones. This reduces risks and at the same time strengthens the negotiating positions of states. For developing countries, this could become a truly historic opportunity. The ability to attract financing secured by their own resources without political conditions means an escape from the debt trap that many of them have been caught in for decades. If this model comes into full effect, we will see a redistribution of economic growth in favor of those regions that were previously considered the periphery of the world economy. Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America could receive a development boost comparable in scale to the industrialization of the mid-20th century. For the US and Europe, this means the need to adapt. The era when it was possible to endlessly export inflation, finance deficits through external demand for currency, and dictate terms through financial institutions is coming to an end. This is not a catastrophe, but it is a serious challenge. They will have to compete not out of habit, but with the quality of the solutions they offer. This is precisely where the topic of digital assets, tokenization, programmable money, and new forms of financial infrastructure comes into play. It is possible that at some point we will see a world where gold is used as a fundamental layer of trust, a kind of anchor of stability, and various digital overlays exist on top of it. Some of these will be controlled by governments, others by decentralized networks, and still others by hybrid structures. In such a world, the concept of money will cease to be singular and universal. It will become modular. Everyone will choose the set of tools that best matches their values, goals, and level of trust in particular institutions. For a private investor, this means the need to think not in terms of a single asset or a single strategy, but in terms of scenarios. It's not about guessing the exact date or price, but about understanding the direction of movement and the logic of change. The world where everything relied on a single center of issuance was convenient, but very fragile. A world with several centers of trust will be more complex, but also more resilient. We are already seeing the first signs of this future. Growing interest in physical assets, attempts by states to regain control over their reserves, experiments with digital currencies, and the rising popularity of decentralized systems. All of these are elements of one large process. It has not yet fully taken shape, but its outlines are becoming increasingly clear. And perhaps the main conclusion here is that money is once again becoming a political and philosophical issue. They are ceasing to be a neutral technical unit of account and are once again becoming a reflection of how society understands value, trust, and responsibility. In this sense, we are living in an extremely interesting time. A time when the fundamental rules of the game are being rewritten not on paper, but in reality, through the actions of states, markets, and millions of individuals.